I'm Donna Marshall with BizLife Solutions, and we're really happy to be here today partnering with Charity Village to share with you some of the recent amendments to the Occupational Health and Safety Act regarding harassment in the workplace. I just want to give you a little bit of background on myself. I actually worked for over a decade in the nonprofit sector, first in a very large nonprofit organization and then in a very small one. And now we work and support nonprofits across the country and into the U.S. regarding issues of psychological safety in the workplace. So I feel I have a good sense of some of the unique features that you're facing working in the nonprofit sector. I'm just moving this. Sorry for 1 second here. There's something on my screen. I want to give you a little bit of background on the Occupational Health and Safety Act to help you understand the legislation. And I thought it might be helpful to share the story of Lori Dupont. Now, some of you may or may not know about this story, but in 2005, Lori was a nurse, a single mom, who got a job at a Windsor hospital. And she started dating a senior doctor at the hospital who was quite revered. And he started harassing her, so she decided to break off the relationship with her, but he wouldn't back off. Eventually, he tracked her into the hospital on one of her shifts and stabbed her to death. It was a horrible story, and it got her mother pushing the government of Ontario to enact legislation that would make harassment and violence hazards in the workplace. Prior to that, the only hazards were hard hat issues, so it might be falling off a scaffolding or something like that. But now she has introduced this violence and harassment as part of the issue. Now, we first came with Bill 168 in 2010, and this was a focus on violence in the workplace with an understanding that harassment can escalate into violence. But the main focus has been on violence. And then for those of you who have been aware of the Jian-Ghomeshi incidents at the CBC, this brought even further media attention to the sexual harassment. So while sexual harassment was an issue under Bill 168, it has now been emphasized in Bill 132. And that amendment took place in March of this year, is referred to as Bill 132, the Sexual Violence and Harassment Action Plan. So there's a lot of information now starting to come out with regard to this legislation and the requirement of employers in Ontario to make sure that they're compliant with this. There's a lot of changes made from the previous Bill 168. I know a number of you are listening to this from across the country, and each province does have its own version of this or is starting to amend their existing legislation to include this because it is such a significant issue. So things are amping up, and one thing you need to know is that a new requirement of the Occupational Health and Safety Act amendment it's no longer enough for companies to just write a policy and put it up and post it in their lunchroom or wherever they choose to post it. This was enough under Bill 168 and actually under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in general. But now employers have a mandatory obligation to ensure the safety of workers from the backlash of reporting. So what has typically happened in our experience is that if someone reports, they may actually move from being the victim where people perceive them as a troublemaker. Why did you raise this issue? That person brings in a lot of funding. And suddenly the victim is portrayed as the perpetrator. And that is now not going to be okay under this new legislation. So employers have mandatory obligations to ensure the safety of workers from workplace violence and harassment, including sexual harassment. But there are also new obligations for employees. So they have new rights, but they also have new responsibilities with regard to reporting incidents of violence and harassment. all with the goal of reducing, or our ideal, of course, would be to eliminate harassment and violence from all workplaces. So the action plan, the Ontario Government Action Plan, we just pulled one powerful statement out of that, and it says, all employees are entitled to a safe and healthy workplace, free from sexual violence and harassment. Our government takes this very seriously. And certainly that seriousness reflects in the new requirements of this legislation. So a lot of times I think all of us think, oh boy, we've got new legislation, new government regulations. What do I have to do? How can I check off the box and really spend my time doing what I want to do? And in the case of all of you, it's contributing to a cause that means a great deal to you. So we agree with you on that. You want to be able to focus on that, meet your requirements, as well as create psychologically safe workplaces. So I want us to just take a second and look at this not as something like a new tax act or some kind of new law that's going to be a pain. I'd like you to think about the legislation as an opportunity for you as an organization to build a culture that's going to create a more productive, more collaborative, and successful workplace. I don't know if any of you have experienced bullying or observed bullying in any of your workplace experience throughout the years, but I think we all know what the ramifications of that can be. So people may take more time off work, they're afraid to talk to the bully, they get sick, they suffer depression and anxiety. There's a lot of fallout that comes out of these issues. So look at this as a real opportunity to be able to create a much safer and healthier and engaged workplace. The legislation is actually good for your organization, its culture, and its sense of safety. So what we're going to look at today are three parts. The first is to help you understand what constitutes harassment under Bill 132. The second is we're going to look at challenges specific to the nonprofit with regard to bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment. And then thirdly, we're going to identify what you need to do to be compliant. So first, what constitutes harassment under Bill 132? This may be a bit tedious for you. I'm now going to put up the two-part definition of harassment, and you're going to go, oh no. So, but I would like you to stick with me while I read it, because this is really the core and the guts of this legislation, and I'm going to break down the definition into different pieces so that you can understand each piece. So I'll start with the first part of the definitions. This was actually Bill 168. Workplace harassment means engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. Now this part B, which in itself has two parts, is the part that has been added with Bill 132. Engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where the course of comment or conduct is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. Or, and this is really important because this now falls on leadership or anyone who has influence in your organization, this is particularly focused on their responsibilities. Making a sexual solicitation or advance where the person making the solicitation or advance is in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit or advancement to the worker, and the person knows or ought reasonably to know that the solicitation or advance is unwelcome. That's very significant. So I'm going to break the definition into different pieces. One thing I do want you to understand is that under the law, for a behavior to be considered harassment, it needs to meet all the criteria of that definition. not just one or two. So I want to look at the first, which is vexatious comment or conduct. So when I ask people in a group, what does vexatious mean? They go, well, we kind of know what it means. It's like not nice. But when you actually look it up, it means irritating, aggravating, annoying. So when you think about how broad that definition, we can all look at ourselves and say, like, perhaps I've been vexatious over the last week or the last month to another person. Maybe I didn't intend it, but they would have considered me irritating, aggravating, or perhaps annoying. You could just ask my husband if you wonder about that one. Then we've got in a workplace. So this is actually very interesting too, because I know in the nonprofit sector there are often a lot of fundraising events. There's travel to clients. There's meeting donors. There's a lot of exposure to potential risk. So in a workplace means wherever a worker is doing work for their employer. So it can be called a mobile workplace if you're in your car or in a truck, somewhere in transition. I heard about a nonprofit situation where a manager was taking a younger woman who was a fundraiser to a particular meeting, and he put his arm around her. It was the first meeting. He said, "Don't worry, I'm there for you." She found it really offensive and having sexual innuendo, which in the end it ended up being so, and he was let go. But these are the kinds of things that can happen. So that's a mobile workplace. She would be considered in the workplace. If you're working for clients outside the office, that's still a workplace. If they go to visit a client in their office, it's still considered the employer's responsibility being in their workplace. So you're responsible and liable for any harassing situation that happens to one of your employees in any of these situations. So throughout this, the legislation will require you to have a written program that will identify the protocols you need to have in place for these potential threats to psychological safety. The term unwelcome can be very confusing. So when you think of the word unwelcome, what comes to mind? The challenge here is that what you may see or experience as unwelcome, I may not, and vice versa. And I actually had a rather glaring example of this when I was visiting a client-facing nonprofit organization. And I came in and there was a client yelling and screaming at the service worker at the nonprofit who was trying to help her. And I was actually getting quite distressed watching and listening to this, as were other observers. But the worker actually seemed kind of unmoved. And after it had de-escalated, I talked to him about the incident, and he said, "It didn't faze me at all. I grew up in a home where everybody was always yelling and screaming at each other. I hardly even heard it." So that in itself is actually pretty concerning. But that aside, it's an example of how, and this is really important to remember, harassment or sexual harassment is in the eye of the beholder and not in the intention of the person acting out the behavior. So for example, I may not care if someone rolls their eyes at me in a meeting, but somebody else may find it very offensive, and it actually could be considered harassment. We've had complaints about that. I may not care if someone says, "Wow, you look really hot today," but somebody else may. We can't know our behavior, how our behavior is going to be received by another person. So it's really important to manage our communication always and our actions very carefully so as to try and not offend. So what is unwelcome? Well, there isn't a specific definition or description in the legislation, but here's some points you might want to keep in mind. It's a really good checklist. So unwelcome would be a behavior or communication that is experienced as unpleasant by the recipient, and I gave you a couple examples of that. The recipient must have reasonable expectations of behavior, and having been called into many nonprofit and other organizations, there have been cases where the expectation of the individual was actually unreasonable. So we have to be very careful to balance it. That said, if someone does report something as feeling like harassment or sexual harassment, you are obliged to investigate that. Also remember that the person who delivers the behavior or communication, and I've said this already, does not determine whether or not it is unwelcome by the recipient. So let me give you some examples of harassment. Now, this is just a partial list. It's really important that not only you know this, but all of your employees know this. I think, you know, we've found that this is a really good way of preventing harassment from occurring, because we found when people are trained in this, when companies train their staff on this, individuals will come forward and say, I had no idea that that could be perceived as harassment. So it actually helps mitigate against incidents before they even occur. So I think we all know this, but it's still something to be aware of: intrusive invasions of personal space. So I had a situation happen a little while ago where a man was sent to one of my training programs on communicating with tact and diplomacy in the workplace. And he said, my employer sent me here, but he didn't tell me why. And the man was talking to me very, very close. It was very uncomfortable. And I said, do you always stand this close to people when you communicate with them? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, that could be part of the problem. And he said, I have a hearing disability, so I have to be really close to people in order to hear them. And so I said, it would just be important for you to let people know that and figure out a way that's comfortable for both of you to be able to communicate. So sometimes these issues are not intended, people aren't even aware, and we have to keep that in mind. There's not necessarily malintent. Other times we know that there absolutely is. So space, inappropriate jokes, setting someone up to fail. So these can be very covert, in fact. I've heard of situations where people say, I knew that the organization wanted to bring in somebody else. I found out later. And so I was really given responsibilities that were outside my realm of understanding and expertise. I wasn't given the training for it, and ultimately I couldn't perform, and I was let go and that person moved in. That would be considered harassment on the part of the workplace or the manager. Vandalism and graffiti, threatening, humiliating, or demeaning pictures or websites, pranks. And again, with pranks, I had delivered a harassment training program at a company, and then the next day there were a couple of guys were kibitzing in the lunchroom and kind of hip-checking each other into the wall. And this woman had been at the training seminar, and she went to her HR person and she said, oh, I think there was harassment going on in the workplace. And so, of course, the HR manager had to call the two guys in. She called them in separately, which is what you need to do in these situations. And she asked each one what happened, and they both were kind of taken aback because they said, oh, we're on the same hockey team together, and we were just replaying our moves last night. So that ended up being nothing. But it also was a good indicator of how things can be misperceived, especially by onlookers, which is another point of the legislation. You can be vicariously harassed. So if I see, for example, I'll go back to the incident of the person who was yelling and screaming at that client worker. If I'd been an employee, I could have said, I felt harassed, I felt traumatized by that, I didn't know if it was going to escalate into violence, which is actually true, and I could have reported it as vicarious harassment. So there's so many levels to this legislation. Threats, overt and covert, you know, if you don't go to dinner with me tonight, you're not going to get that raise, anything like that. Lewd remarks made verbally or electronically. Shunning someone, of course, we all might have a bad day. We don't say hi to somebody. We're on our, you know, on our phones or whatever. But if we're consistently leaving somebody out of the loop of information, then that could be considered shunning, which is also an example of harassment. Scapegoating somebody. I did something wrong, but consistently I'm blaming somebody else for it, saying they didn't do this, they didn't do that, that's why I couldn't do my job. and this goes into damaging someone's reputation through gossip or other means. Certainly yelling is considered harassment. And I haven't put here micromanaging, I've said extreme micromanaging. So I had someone report to me that a manager in her workplace was moving her desk closer and closer to this woman to the point where she was literally sitting beside her, looking over her shoulder, looking at everything she wrote, asking her questions where everything was all the time. And this is extreme micromanagement. And the results of this, as you can only imagine, is that she was scared to do anything. She was basically afraid, working in fear. She left for mental health reasons, understandably, and then she sued the organization and the manager. And the manager had, in fact, harassed her through extreme micromanaging. And I want to, again, differentiate micromanagement. Sometimes, you know, we need to be involved and on top of things, but in a correct performance management way. What is not harassment? So just at the time of Bill 168, I was going in and doing some harassment training, and a manager said to me, an employee came up to her and was saying that he found her performance feedback to be completely unwelcome, and he was going to make an official complaint of harassment against her, which he did. And we started to see these things happening more and more, misuse of the legislation, and seeing that too many managers were being targeted by their employees. So we have been before the Ministry of Labour in Ontario as consultants to this legislation, and we actually pointed the next piece out and recommended that they add this to the legislation, which we're very pleased to see that they did. So what is not harassment? The legislation says a reasonable action taken by an employer or a supervisor relating to the management and direction of workers or the workplace is not harassment. And I think that's also very comforting. And when you do your employee training, I do an online course on this, and I make this very clear that that you know there's responsibility on all sides, and we can't misuse the legislation. So now I want to go to examples of sexual harassment. Now this part is all new to the legislation since Bill 168. Not that sexual harassment wasn't considered harassment, but under Bill 132, as you saw when we read it, it's been identified as an issue in and of itself. So here are some examples. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you an idea. So any communications of a sexual nature, whether verbal, written, or electronic, and nonverbal, actually, we could add to that. So if you're looking somebody up and down, that would be a nonverbal communication. Inappropriate or unwanted touching. Again, we've got that word unwanted. Someone who may not be very self-aware, or someone who has a fairly big ego and thinks that people might be quite interested in them, may actually think that people do want to be touched or do want to have some kind of sexual attention. Lies or gossip about a person's sex life, orientation, or romantic activities. Unwanted, flirtatious comments or compliments, graphic or graphic pictures, cartoons, calendars, websites. I think we're all pretty aware of that now, but worth mentioning. The nonverbal is again an example, staring or ogling, particularly at sexual body parts. It's called elevator eyes. Certainly stalking someone is a terrifying thing to do, and it actually borders on the definition of violence under the legislation. Touching a person's hair, clothes, or body. I had a woman report to me once that her boss came up behind her and was smelling her hair. And she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, it just smells like my wife's shampoo." So not okay. Touching oneself sexually around another person. Standing too close or brushing up against another person unnecessarily. Now, there are times, of course, when we're in tight quarters and we have to move past somebody, but of course being extremely conscious of that. Now I want to go back to the second part of the sexual harassment definition, which is about someone who has a position of influence, misusing that influence for sexual purposes. So an example is if you go out for dinner with me, we can discuss your bonus. So it's an if-then. There's an unstated threat. I'll consider investing or making a donation if Sue or Joe is the one you assign to my account. Unfortunately, we find that this kind of situation happens not infrequently in some nonprofits. And I'll get you that research funding if you come back to my room with me. So these are just a few examples of how this could occur. So I've given you a lot of information right now. I'd like you to just take a minute, step back, and think about what does your nonprofit organization have in place to educate, train, and respond to harassing behaviors. Typically, we'll find that most organizations do have a code of conduct, and if you don't, I'd strongly recommend that you put one of those together. It's very helpful, and if all employees are made aware of this, it just can work towards prevention. It's also a way if any incidents happen that you can come back and say that we did give you our code of conduct. Certainly, we've talked about policies, and I imagine you all have your policies relevant in your province to harassment and sexual harassment legislation. Training is a huge part of prevention and education. So there needs to be training. Actually, this legislation, N Bill 168, actually requires that there be training, that every employee, and we recommend in the case of nonprofits, all volunteers and all board members, also receive training on this legislation so that they understand very clearly what is and is not acceptable under the legislation. And it also gives you leverage in dealing with incidents that occur. So where it says that ought to be known or ought reasonably to be known, that part of the legislation, once you've trained employees, volunteers, board members, they do know. So that covers you off in terms of liability. The training is a huge piece of this. So we do our online training for leadership because they have different requirements, and for employees, but there's a stipulation on what they need to know to do and not do. A new piece to this legislation, which is significant, is the requirement for a written program, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. So previously a policy was enough, and quite honestly, a number of organizations I've been in, they had the policy, but people still felt harassed and were harassed and felt they had no way to deal with it except to leave and then sue the organization. This legislation, again, this is something that Dr. Bott and I at bizlife informed the government of, was the need for a written program so that there is something that employees know and employers know. This is how we're going to handle these incidents. So a written program. And then the next part, which is often missing, is ensuring accountability and compliance. So everybody's trained, you've got your written program, your codes of conduct, and your policies. But if we aren't holding people accountable and equally accountable, regardless of their level in the organization, these issues are going to continue. So the accountability is a huge part of this. I'm not going to touch on it a lot right now, but one way is by adding some of these behavioral markers into your performance reviews. So that's not for this time, but just be aware you do need to have an accountability and responsibility system in place as well. So Section 2, specific challenges with bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment in the nonprofit sector. You are in a catch-22 situation. And this is really specific to nonprofits that other organizations may not have to face. And the problem is this: 78% of harassers outrank their targets. So it may not be a person's direct boss or leader, but it may be It may be a funder or a donor. It may be a board member. It may be your boss's best friend who's the head of some department in the organization. It's just that these people are senior to the people that they harass. So that's a problem. The second problem, unique to you, is that nonprofit organizations depend on donors and influential volunteers and other people to fund and sustain your mission. These volunteers have power. Some may abuse it, whether it's to feed their own egos, experience a sense of power, get their own way, even though it may not be in the best interests of the organization, and it certainly isn't in the best interests of individuals who are feeling harassed and bullied by them. Nonprofits depend on these individuals to meet their fundraising goals, and there's your catch-22. And the way we deal with this is actually in the written program, but I think it's important that we all just acknowledge this as a specific challenge that you are or will face with regard to this legislation. So I want to just take a minute to think about the impact of harassment, including sexual harassment, and the impact it can have on your workplace. So I've talked to probably hundreds of organizations, many hundreds of organizations around these issues over the last few years. And I've had some that say to me, you know, we bullying and harassment in our workplace. And my response is, my guess is it's happening, you just don't know about it. Typically, people who are bullied and harassed don't report. And it's understandable because they're going to either lose or leave their jobs if they do. Typically, that is what happens. So what they do is people will stay and suffer in silence. 45% of targets suffer stress-related mental health problems, and we know what happens then. Certainly your disability costs go up, pharmaceutical costs, people are missing, you have to hire new people or temps. Like, the fallout of this is huge. 50% of workplace harassment victims suffer mental health-related problems. And these are generally what we've experienced them to be because Dr. Bott has a psychological practice. And our research shows that the main mental health issues related to bullying and harassment are anxiety, depression, PTSD, and then the turning to addiction, so turning to some substance to be able to cope, which then all of these we know has a ripple effect across individuals, their families, and the organization. Workplace violence and harassment is found to be responsible for more lost productivity in the workplace than any other cause, and that's pretty shocking. So the outcome of all of this is that workplace violence and harassment is responsible for more productivity. I've just mentioned that. Bullied employees take on average, now this is reported. We have to understand that this is significantly unreported. So our reports show that bullied employees take on average 7 more sick days than others. Still, if you extrapolate that over time in your organization, and the other subsequent costs related to that, that gets pretty expensive. The cost of employee absence in Canada due to these interpersonal hazards is $12 billion per year. What are the incidences of harassment in the workplace? This is a great study, and if you read Dr. Bott's and my article, you would have seen it referenced by Dr. Jacqueline Power. Nearly half of Canadians report having experienced 1 or more acts of workplace harassment at least once a week for the last 6 months. So again, you may feel that it's not happening in your workplace, but I think it probably is. 28% of Canadians say they have been on the receiving end of unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or sexually charged talk while on the job. So if you think about this, it's saying that 1 in 5 Canadian workers are being harassed at least once a week. This is happening in every workplace, whether it's the bullying volunteer, the passive-aggressive employee, some board member that might be highly abrasive and controlling. It's happening. So these incidents do tend to be underreported, as I said. And this is mainly because the worker feels that the employer either won't deal safely and fairly with the report, so how do I know there's going to be confidentiality, which is a significant part of the new legislation as well, ensuring confidentiality, that the person with power or influence will not be held accountable, so I'm going to put myself out there and then they're going to keep doing it, and they may in fact target me for having reported it, which does happen, or that the whistleblower syndrome will take place. So there's always negative impact when harassment or bullying is happening in any workplace. We've talked about reduced productivity, increased stress leave, and mental health issues related to psychological trauma. It's a serious issue in every workplace. So now we understand the complexities, requirements around harassment and sexual harassment. What can we do? And there are some solutions, so have no fear. We've got the solutions for you. The legislation says that your organization, employers and supervisors, must take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. And I want to say we work very closely with a legal firm on everything we do and all the programs and training that we have. And we're privy to a number of legal cases that have actually been precedent-setting regarding an organization not taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances, and there are stiff requirements on organizations to be following proper protocols. So an employer shall provide a worker with information and instruction, so this is training, that is appropriate for the worker, the content of the policy, and the written program, I've added written, they refer to it later, with respect to harassment and any other prescribed information. So this is one little sentence and it's loaded. Training, a written program, and a policy. So let's start with policies. According to the OHSA, Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario, an employer shall prepare a policy with respect to workplace violence, prepare a policy with respect to workplace harassment. And I want to point out that workplace harassment is also under the Human Rights Act, and each province has its how that plays out. In Ontario, it's the Human Rights Tribunal that will investigate incidents of harassment under human rights. Under human rights, the focus is on discrimination. Under occupational health and safety, it's around behavior. And the behavior is, are some of the examples that we've talked about. But again, much more nebulous and difficult to pin down in some cases. So these have to be separate policies, and they have to target harassment under occupational health and safety. And review the policy as often as necessary, but at least annually. Post all policies in a place where they are accessible and visible for all workers to see. And we actually recommend that you make sure people sign off for you that they have read the policy. I think it's important for you to have that in your files. Now, the problem with this issue of harassment and sexual harassment is that there are a lot of barriers to reporting. And that's why you need, and the Ministry of Labor has said, you need more than a policy. A policy is the bare minimum. I'm just going to review some stats. We need more than a policy because 78% of bullies outrank their targets and people are afraid to report. Targets endure 2 years of bullying before filing a complaint or leaving, and people go, why wouldn't they just report it right away? But if you think of it, most people desperately need their jobs, and they try and work it out. They may try and work around things. They may take courses to find out how they can deal with the bully. They'll do all kinds of things before actually going and putting themselves at risk to make a report, or they just leave. And that's frequently what happens, and organizations lose really, really great people when this happens. targets have a 70% chance of losing or leaving their jobs when they complain. So that's where our concept, Dr. Bott and I developed the Harassment Education Advisory Response Team program back in 2010 in relation to Bill 168. And we created a heart team idea where a group of individuals within an organization from every level, it might be the receptionist, it might be somebody in warehouse, it could be anyone, as well as HR if they're in the organization, and a union rep, are on the heart committee, and we train them how to be first responders to incidents. And then the fear of reporting actually goes way down, because I feel I can go to a colleague who's been trained and just talk about it. It doesn't have to become a formal report. I can get information, or maybe I do want to move forward. But that trained team is just a great way of bypassing the barriers to reporting and creating psychological safety. Now I want to talk about the written program. So the legislation says an employer shall, in consultation with the committee, so in this case we have our heart committee, or a health and safety representative, if any, develop and maintain a written program to implement the policy with respect to workplace harassment. The Ministry of Labour in Ontario has actually trained a lot more supervisors to come in and review the written programs that organizations have and make sure that all the protocols are in place. I do want to mention, if you have a health and safety representative in your organization, what we've found is that the people who gravitate towards being on a health and safety committee may or may not have the expertise needed to deal with psychological and mental health issues. So their expertise is in health and safety. Certainly myself, my background's in psychological health and safety. I would never even begin to be a part of any committee that had anything to do with engineering or chemicals. That would be a danger to the organization. And likewise, we want to train people who maybe have some background in that, who have a high level of communication skills, you know, who we would screen and train to be representatives on this committee, and then to follow through on the written program. So the legislation says that the written program must, quote, set out how incidents or complaints of how workplace harassment will be investigated and dealt with. Now, what I've found is that most people are in business or in not-for-profits or have specialized areas of expertise and are professionals in their areas of expertise. But understandably, they don't know, because it's not their area of expertise, how do you deal with complaints in a psychologically safe manner? And what happens if people don't report the incidents then? If you haven't set up a written program that does create that safety, people continue to go underground. Then you're back to your stress leave, mental health issues, people leaving, and certainly in a number of cases, litigation can be expected to occur. So reporting and having that written program and protocols, it actually creates that culture of accountability that we were talking about earlier. Respect and safety leading higher to productivity and engagement. So we don't want these things to go underground. Of course, we don't want to know that they're happening, but better to know and deal with them than to be hit with liability, or in a very, very worst case scenario. I think we may know about the reporter at the Toronto Star who committed suicide because of the toxic work environment and that she reported, and the sexual harassment that she felt that she received. So that's our very worst case scenario. Now, there are demanding requirements in this legislation for nonprofits, and I'm sure at this point you're going, wow, there's a lot here. This feels really overwhelming to me, and it's demanding for any organization, but I think, again, nonprofits, because you know, you're facing limited budgets. You all have to work within tight budgets and accountability around that. Your time is stretched. You're very dedicated to your cause, and you have a lot that you're probably juggling. So you don't have time to do this. There aren't staff often. We find in the smaller and medium-sized nonprofits, there isn't an HR staff. In cases where there are HR staff, again, there may be limited budget or time to be able to deal with this because there's so many other demands. And the next thing is understanding the legislation. So there's two parts to the legislation. One is the hard legal part of it. And the legal part, as we all know, is very costly. And it doesn't really get into the depths of understanding of interpersonal dynamics. It's not like other legislation on, you know, how to take visa. You do this, you don't do that, and it's very strict on this. And it's, while it may be cumbersome, it is very clear. It's a checklist. And this is also typical of traditional health and safety legislation. You label chemicals in a certain way. You know, it's all very straightforward. But what happens when you've got these unknowns or very unclear things like unwelcome behavior and vexatious comment or conduct? Like, that goes beyond an understanding of specific right and wrong. We can guess, we can know, but again, when it's taken from the position of the person who feels they've been harassed, there's a lot going on there. So there needs to be an understanding of how to build a psychologically strong program as well that's going to protect people and create an openness and safety. So this is the really challenging part for people who aren't trained in psychology and in the psychology of power differentials, victimization, relational dynamics, all of those kinds of things. How could people not trained in this begin to be able to create a program that is sound and meets not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of it, which is really what I think is very beautiful about this legislation, that we can take this and create a spirit of health and safety and care for the people within our organization, as well as the causes that we're serving outside of our organization. So I mentioned that Dr. Bott and I created the HEART program, Harassment Education Advisory Response Team concept and program. And we are actually partnering, and very happy and pleased to be partnering with Charity Village on offering this program. This is a written program. It's got fill in the blanks. It's all customizable for you, and we're offering it to you for a much reduced rate as a partner, as partnering with Charity Village, and we're very happy to do that. We're happy to support you in anything that you need regarding this implementation of this legislation, or just information on how to handle situations in your workplace. So the manual has a lot of information, but I'll just touch on the highlights. It shows you how to create a safe reporting structure, and we've got forms and documents and handouts, policies, everything that you need to be compliant, and also to create a respectful workplace. We've got handouts for people who've been victims. We've got handouts for people who've been accused, how to do a safe, confidential investigation. That's a huge part of this legislation, and how you ensure that. We do that in our training as well, to teach you as a HEART team, or we also call it a peer support team. However you want to frame it, that it fits in your organization, to create not only legislative compliance, but again, a really safe and healthy workplace. So you really fill in the blanks, and you're good to go on that. The other thing that the legislation requires, as we mentioned, is training. So you need to train all your employees. We always recommend to nonprofits, your volunteers and boards, because a lot of problems can come up for you if they haven't been trained, and they can say, I didn't know. So you want everybody to be able to say, I did know, I was trained, and you want to have evidence to show that everyone was trained on the requirements. You need, and the ministry will be and is requiring tracking and reporting on that. Again, we're so happy to be partnering with Charity Village, and we've got this compliance training online at a very affordable price. Bill132training.ca, or you can contact Charity Village directly if you like, and they can certainly forward to us. So our compliance training, you can't beat it, $15 a person, and you'll have everybody trained. The Heart Written program, which includes your policies, measures, procedures, and programs in a customizable format, and we're giving Charity Village a 10% discount on that written program. I just want to say personally, from BizLife Solutions, we really love working with our many partners, but especially our nonprofits, because we feel that we do share a heart for a cause that we really believe in, which is that people feel psychologically safe, that they aren't suffering from mental health issues related to bullying and harassment, and that they can enjoy the wonderful work that I know you are all doing out there in the world. So thank you so much for spending this time with me, and reach out to me anytime if you'd like, and I'm always happy to chat. I've got some phone numbers and contact information there, and again, just contact Charity Village if you aren't, if you need to get through to us. So thanks very much. I think, Marina, you said that there might be some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. What a packed presentation that was. That was excellent stuff, and we have a lot of questions coming in. We're going to do our best to answer some of them today in our short Q&A, but let's get started with this one. How does the legislation cover external consultants who may not actually be employees but may be harassed or bullied by board or leadership when they're working with the organization?
So that is a fantastic question. So whenever there are consultants, what we recommend is that you get evidence from the consultant that they've been trained in this, whether it's like an independent consultant, that they've got the training through whatever means that they do, or whether they maybe represent another organization. Let's say maybe it's a marketing firm. So that marketing firm has provided that training and you have that in writing. But you do need to know that anybody who represents you, you need to have evidence that they have received this training.
Great. Now, does the bill cover cyber violence, both at work and outside of work hours between employees?
It talks about vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace. So certainly cyber violence would be, actually it's considered violence. So I didn't touch on the definition of violence in the workplace under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but it does fall under that definition.
Great. Now, I believe you mentioned in the legislation it refers to a course of action or the word course is indicated. Does that mean that it has to be a repeated action or can it be a one-off?
Another great question. So, and good observation. So a course of means a pattern of. That is not to say that, let's say that one-off incident where I told you about that person screaming at that worker, that's a one-off incident of harassment. So that can be considered harassment, absolutely, because it meets the other definitions within the legislation. But usually, like bullying tends to be a pattern. In litigation, they are looking generally for a pattern, yes.
Okay. And if a supervisor is providing some performance management feedback to an employee and the employee finds they are uncomfortable with this feedback, obviously that could be an awkward situation. Do you have any suggestions for the supervisor who might be providing that type of feedback, how to do it in a way that isn't construed as harassment?
So again, we have to be cautious on both sides, don't we? Because I was in a nonprofit where a coordinator was reporting to a woman, and she accused her boss, this woman, of harassing her by just the use of her terminology, et cetera, et cetera. And I was called in by the nonprofit to do an investigation, and I said, based on all of this, it's actually the coordinator who's harassing the manager because the manager felt they could not do their job, that they couldn't give feedback, like it was constantly, you're doing this, you're saying that. So I would say to be on, if you are concerned at all about giving performance feedback, I would actually do it with another person if you can. Make sure you're in an area, like you don't want it to be totally open because it's confidential, but if you're concerned at all, you know, if you can have HR part of that. The other thing is to really script yourself. So sometimes I recommend to managers, actually write out your script of what you're going to say to that person ahead of time, and then just follow your script. So that, and even when managers have been concerned, I've said, rehearse your script, give a copy of your script to HR, ask them if they think that it's okay. When you do the debriefing, follow your script, don't get sidelined. And that's maybe if you're really concerned about someone, then that's probably the best way to do it. I think if you're gentle and thoughtful but direct and respectful, that could not be construed as unwelcome.
Great. Now, I think a lot of our organizations that are attending today probably are in this situation. So if there's an organization where there's no actual HR person, so there's no real
Yes.
confidential HR, how does an employee report harassment when it's the employer that's doing the harassment and
That's right.
be the person you have to report to?
And that's why we created this written program, this whole concept of a written program and a hard team. Like every organization needs to have either an individual. So another piece of the legislation I didn't talk to is that if a person is afraid to report to the supervisor, it is required by the employer that they have someone or a committee within the organization assigned and trained to deal with complaints of harassment, and that's the heart team or the peer support team. So if there isn't an HR, all the more reason that there must be that committee or independent person trained to manage these issues. So it's not even, and I'm so glad this person brought it up, whoever brought this up, it's not an option. So there has to be someone, and we recommend a committee of at least 3 people, so there's lack of bias, to be able to address these issues. Good question.
So I guess what you're saying there, Donna, is that the size of an organization really doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, great. And how about volunteers? Are volunteers required to be trained, and do you have suggestions for an organization that might see harassment happening either between volunteers or, you know, a volunteer to a staff member?
Right. So while it isn't required, in every nonprofit that we consult with and work with and support, we strongly recommend, because anything can come back to you in terms of litigation, anything can come back to you in terms of how a person's being treated, and you're held responsible, and you are responsible for their safety and their psychological safety. So volunteers and board members under this legislation don't get to be, in fact, they're actually targeted in the legislation as having additional responsibilities to not use their power in that way. So we strongly recommend, and all our clients do this, that you put the volunteers through the online training program, and you put your board members through the leadership training program that we offer. And then that way, we track it, or you can track it. You can look at it yourself. It doesn't matter. And then you have the tracking. So if anything comes up, if there's ever a lawsuit, then you can say this board member was informed and we have the evidence that they were. It's just not okay anymore. And I know you're in a tough situation because of that catch-22 we talked about. But the good news about this legislation is it actually gives you a great opportunity to educate and prevent these issues from happening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Donna. So how frequently does the training need to happen?
So everybody needs to be trained on this. So even if people have been trained on Bill 168, OHSA, Bill 168, Violence and Harassment in the Workplace, they now need to be retrained on this legislation. So every employee, every leader, in your case, every volunteer and every board member does need to be trained on this legislation as soon as possible. So they're setting September the 8th as the target date. I tell organizations, as long as you're starting into the process, because it takes a while to organize, as long as you're starting into that process and you can show that you've started into the process, you're fine. And then so example, maybe if you have new volunteers, like you have rotating fundraising programs or something, and you have different people coming on throughout the year, then what we do is we just have an ongoing arrangement with the nonprofit that every time they get somebody new, they send us their email address, and we set them up, and they watch the training, and the employer just says, we need you to do this before we move forward with you, or within the next week or whatever, and then we just set them up, and they go on and watch it, and you've got the training done. It's about a 20-minute training program online.
Okay. And we've had a few people ask, is it okay to have one policy that covers both the violence and the harassment aspects? Or
sorry, you cut out there, Maureen.
Oh, sorry. Is it okay to have one policy that covers both the violence and the harassment pieces, or do you need to have two separate policies?
You need to have two separate policies.
Okay. Great. So that should provide some clarification for some of those folks that were asking that
yes.
question.
And that is frequently misunderstood, but they are so differently represented, and the protocols around violence are so different than harassment. And kind of the layers of violence is actually easier for people to understand. We understand when something's violent. It's very confusing what harassment might be in some cases, so that's why they have to be completely separate.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we're going to call it there for questions today. We are running up on time.
Okay.
So I want to thank you, Donna, again for a great presentation today. Lots of information.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you, everybody, for being part of this.
Wonderful. And just before we sign off today, I do want to remind everyone we will follow up with you by email tomorrow morning with the webinar recording and the presentation slides. And I know a lot of you were asking about the HEART program and the cost and details and all of that. We'll include some links in that email as well in case you want to check it out so that you can get all of the answers to those questions. And as Donna mentioned, you can always reach out to the contact information she's provided, or you can reach out to us directly at Charity Village as well. In that email, we're also going to have a link to a short survey. If you can take a minute to fill that out, it's really helpful for us to further refine our webinar content and our delivery. You'll have an opportunity to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session. So I do encourage you to take a moment to fill that out. And with that, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you, Donna, and I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.